Hello and welcome to EnRoute, the podcast where we talk about life along the way. I'm Dennis Sanders and I am your host. Make sure that you visit the website enroutepodcast.org, and while you're there, you can subscribe to the show on various podcast platforms like Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or via RSS. We hope you'll consider doing that. It makes it easier for you to not ever miss a show. And while you're at it, if you have found value in this show, I would so appreciate it if you would leave a rating, especially on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or whatever platform you listen to. That helps for people to find the show, makes it much easier. And also, simply tell a friend about the show. That helps a lot as well. A few months ago, I did an episode where I shared my own experience of being a pastor during the COVID-19 pandemic. And at the end of that episode, I asked for other pastors to share their experiences. Well, one pastor answered back. His name is Joe Tognetti, and he is a United Methodist pastor and pastor of Rio First United Methodist Church in Rio Grande City, Texas. And if you know your geography, Rio Grande is Grand City is a border town. It's located in the Rio Grande Valley, so it's basically right on the U.S.-Mexico border. In this interview, Joe shares the ups and downs of being a pastor at this really once-in-a-century event, and he shares what happened with his congregation during the worst of the pandemic, what happened to him during this time. I think it was a really great conversation, and I hope, especially if you're a pastor, but even if you aren't, and we're working from home, that you'll get some good insight about this. So, with that, here is Joe Tognetti. Oh gosh. Well, thank you, Joe, for joining me on this episode. To start,
Yeah, you are welcome. You're welcome.
you're
It's
welcome.
it's a
Yeah,
blessing
thank
and a
you.
privilege.
Great, great. Well, to start things off, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and then the church where you serve?
Yes, so I am a really in real life middle age, but for churches they still consider pastors in their mid 30s to be young. So I guess I'm a young pastor. If you're under 55, I think they consider you young. And so I'm a youngish pastor in. I grew up actually in San Francisco, California.
Okay.
Went to public school through, to back up a little bit, had five brothers and sisters, two sisters, three brothers. Then went K through 8 public school, went to Catholic school. We grew up Roman Catholic in our family. Went to Catholic school for high school, then went to Trinity University, which despite the name is not an especially religious school, although there is a chapel and a chaplain, but beyond that, it's basically a secular university in San Antonio.
Okay.
Went there for college, and I have stayed in Texas ever since. And I thought I was going to go to law school, and it turns out I was just called to marry a lawyer. My wife is currently an assistant district superintendent. Not superintendent. Assistant district attorney for Hidalgo County, which for those who might be intimidated by that, she works on the civil side.
Okay.
She works in their civil litigation division. So if you're in Hidalgo County and commit a crime or get accused of a crime, she's not dealing with your stuff. And a long story short, I mean, I know that the point here is not my call story. So over the years, through college, I was an active Roman Catholic. After that, I went through a period of discernment, and then after I got waitlisted at law school, my now wife, then girlfriend, suggested that I pray about God's next steps.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of regrets that because I was called to be a pastor. And so then it was a couple of years. I served as a youth minister of a Presbyterian church, a PCUSA, so the main line. And I ended up settling on the United Methodist Church for a number of reasons. And in our system, the bishop moves pastors. Mm-hmm. So, we don't have a call system, which has its drawbacks, but also its benefits. One of the great benefits of the system is that churches don't have to spend 6 months to a year and a half looking for a pastor, mm-hmm. right? And what I see it is it really benefits the churches like the ones that I've served most of my ministry and like the ones I serve now, rural churches where pastors who are seminary educated it may not be their first choice to go to a rural area, mm-hmm. But that's where the need is. And so the bishop can say, look, this is where you're needed. And so I'm blessed. I've served churches in Central Texas, in San Antonio, and for the last 5.5 years, I have served in what's called the Rio Grande Valley, which is a region, the southernmost 4 counties in Texas. Mm-hmm. 3 of them are directly on the border. 1 of them is just barely north of the border. And I currently serve in Starr County, which is the westernmost county in that region. I serve First United Methodist Church, Rio Grande City. If folks want to learn more about it, it's riofumc.org. And also we're on Facebook and YouTube, Rio FUMC. We stream our services, although we are back in person. We do offer worship in Spanish and English. We're an English dominant church, but we do have individuals who prefer Spanish. And so I'm blessed that I've grown. I'm not going to pull a Beto O'Rourke and try to bust out my Spanish here, but I'm strong enough in my Spanish that I can get by.
Okay.
And a little bit about just in terms of the some of the things that perhaps you're interested in and your listeners might be interested in with respect to COVID. In many ways, the Rio Grande Valley, that region that I live in, and many border counties in general in Texas, I can't speak to as much other states, but at least in Texas, we're both the hardest hit mm-hmm. in terms of deaths and infections, because it's a place of a lot of transit. And that is not just cross-border traffic, although some people like jump to that. That's not just that. A lot of it is traffic along the border, especially major highways coming through. And also a lot of our residents, especially in Starr County, a lot of our residents work in oil fields. And so there's a lot of transit and transportation that couldn't be limited, and so we got hit hard. We were a hard hit region. Our county was really hard hit. But also in many ways, our local response has been as strong as one could expect. Mm-hmm. We were among the first to implement lockdowns, and really people abided by that. Even when masks became optional statewide, you didn't start seeing people regularly not wear masks indoors until an extraordinarily high percentage of residents became vaccinated. Okay. And you still see in the gas stations and other places where where a lot of people might be from out of town, they're not from here. You'll still see a lot of people wearing masks because we have Fort Texas. It's not true for everywhere in the U.S., but Fort Texas, we have among the strongest vaccination rates in the state as a whole, and especially for this is a relatively impoverished community, although mm-hmm. I don't mean that emotionally and socially. I mean that financially. Emotionally mm-hmm. and socially, it's a strong community in so many ways, but financially, it's an impoverished community. relatively speaking, and it's a predominantly Hispanic community. Just one kind of aside is my wife and I went to a July 4th event in a neighboring town, Roma, which is also in our county. Literally the only white people there, and there was someone who used to work at my daughter's daycare who recognized my wife and may have seen us like twice, but just because like we're the white people, so it is
kind of hard to miss.
Yeah, so it's dominantly Hispanic.
Okay.
And so for a predominantly Hispanic area, for a low income area, we've had an extraordinarily strong response with regard to COVID. I think the biggest challenge that our communities have faced and our churches have faced, and this may be where some of your questions are going, is with people re-engaging in their church community. And we faced that as a church, and I know other congregations have faced that throughout the region and in our city. And so that's probably more than you wanted to know about me and about my church. But go ahead and ask your questions.
Sure. Well, I think one of the first things I would want to know is, when did you kind of realize things were going to change, that you were going to have to stop meeting in person? For me, that was in, I think, March 11th, March 12th, that we just decided, we can't worship on Sunday. And, like many people thought it was just going to be a few weeks.
Yeah.
And 14 months later. And so I'm kind of curious, what was it like for you during that time in March of 2020? And how did you come to a decision of what you were going to do for worship and right then and there?
Yeah, so it was probably about March 11th, March 12th. I can't remember exactly the day. I think it was March 10th. It was a couple days after the NCAA, the March Madness was canceled.
Yeah.
And the NBA season was canceled. And so we actually already had record low attendance that Sunday. We did have in-person attendance, but we had record low. And I'll be honest, I tried to take a middle ground. I did not take it as seriously or urgently as some, but also there were others who, were already starting to like, it's just the flu. And I took it more seriously than that. And so I was anticipating that we would just kind of ride it out and be able to, we didn't have passing of the peace. And there were people who were shocked by that I said, no, like, we're not going to do that. We're not going to touch. There's an older member who is so precious, and she loves her hugs. And I said, I'm sorry, we're just not going to do it. So we were doing a couple things in that regard, but then a couple days later, just dominoes started to fall countywide, citywide, statewide. And so our ad council had an emergency meeting, and we just said, we're just going to have to go online. It was very quick, and it was really consensus driven. There wasn't a whole lot of controversy about it. I think different people had different opinions, and to also give context, politically, we're a purple county, which everyone thought we were blue, but it turns out the Republicans just weren't voting. So politically, we're a very light blue, purple county, lean Democrat, but not very strongly. And so there are a lot of people who politically you would think would have been, resistant, it'll be fine, just based on political stereotypes. But a lot of those folks weren't. They were very supportive. My congregation reflects my community in the political divides, and yet pretty much everyone was on the same page that we just needed. And so, we thought we'd be able to meet at Easter, then we thought we'd meet at May, then we thought, and it kept getting delayed, as you know. Mm-hmm. So it really was a very fast domino effect that,
So had you already had any experience doing, and I'm assuming you did, online worship? Has that been anything you ever had done before? How did you, as a congregation, manage? How did you manage?
We did not. I had not. And it was extraordinarily time consuming. It was exciting at first, but of course it also got frustrating. it also, one dynamic that I discovered too late was that I discovered too late that even though we have a congregation where most people are at least proficient in Spanish and English,
Mm-hmm.
especially our English speaking folks did not want a bilingual service, but I really didn't hear that. So that was part of initial hiccups, is that we were doing a bilingual. I was stumbling through it, trying to do one bilingual service online. The editing process took a lot longer than I thought it would. And I was trying to encourage participation, so I didn't record live. I was having people read from their homes, offer music from their homes. And yet, but the editing process really took a logistical toll. And luckily, I'm grateful that my predecessor had instituted a website, had created a website with online giving.
Mm-hmm.
And we did have a YouTube page that we really didn't use. I mean, I frankly didn't know anything about it. But at the time we had an administrative assistant. And so she graciously was like, hey, we have this. And so YouTube and Facebook, we were able to kind of do that very quickly, but it was a steep learning curve for me. We had some things in place to be able to do it, but it was still not something we'd ever done before.
And what about other church activities? Did you try to do mission projects during that time? And how did you try, since, it was hard to get together?
Yeah, so eventually, this was much later in the year that we, those first few months and even through the summer was just a lot of stumbling.
Mm-hmm.
And we tried to stay connected with small groups and that, honestly, like Zoom small groups, or that flopped mostly. Even our youth group, it just didn't. There were a lot of things we tried that didn't work. What was really successful, we had a Thanksgiving ministry. Normally we give food baskets. Instead, we gave gift cards. And so that was helpful. We also had a Christmas ministry where normally members donate toys, but in this time, we had one person, a church member who's part of that ministry, and it's a ministry for a town across the border in Camargo. Mm-hmm. And so this one family is really in charge of that. So we said, to minimize contact with physical things, the church we were just going to raise money, and folks who gave money went to that effort, and that minimized, and then they were responsible for purchasing all the toys and all that. So, and we got receipts. I mean, it was a good process. We did do some food bank outreach, and eventually earlier this year, we did vaccine outreach to ensure that our members were connected. But yeah, honestly, I think other churches probably had more success than we did. But once a lot of our events were canceled, folks really got deflated. Our summer camp for youth got canceled, things of that nature. And it was just tough to hang on to the Sunday worship. That was a lot of it.
Did you see the number of people who maybe attended worship go down during that period?
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay. It definitely, initially there was excitement about it, and then it dropped to, so pre-COVID, we, our last full year of recording, our average was 64 in worship. Mm-hmm. And, probably January through March pre-COVID, it was like 58, 59. So you're talking 60 online views. Really, after the first month or two, it probably settled in the 30s to 40s. Mm-hmm. And now we did do some things that helped. That initially we just put it on YouTube and then posted it to Facebook. What we ended up doing was we switched that order, because more of our members were engaged in Facebook than YouTube. Mm-hmm. And so we actually, the video was embedded in Facebook. And that's actually how we currently do our live worship. Now that we're back in worship, we currently stream it live on Facebook and then post it to YouTube. And we found that did help stem some of that decline, so to speak. But yeah, no, we probably, in terms of engagement, we're at about 50%. And we did have, I would say the one thing we had, I tried to get a Zoom Bible study organized that didn't pan out. We did do online video Bible studies, and we got some engagement with that. We did one on Revelation. There was one on, I was trying to be inspirational, so there was one based on Max Lucado, who's a little bit outside my normal comfort zone, but it was good stuff. God will carry you through. Mm-hmm. And then I think I did one other one, and I can't remember what it was, to be honest. But we've since, I would say about 50 or so percent stayed engaged. And that, while we've seen a little bit of an increase since, both, for combined online and in person, probably hasn't changed much since, even though we've been back, even without masks, for about 2 months.
Did you lose any people totally during that period?
I think there are probably, 10 to 15 of those 60 or so are going to be extremely tough to get back. Mm. That's just the truth. I mean, some, and I don't, we've worked really hard, and I've worked really hard to stay connected with folks, make phone calls, do visits. You can always do more, there's always more you can do. But yeah, I think there was definitely a loss of connection in that area. Hmm.
So one of the other things that's kind of fascinating is how pastors themselves went through that period. I think a lot of people felt a lot more busy, even though they weren't necessarily in church. And there was also been a lot of burnout, I think, that people have dealt with. And so how did you handle all that? What did you experience going through that period?
Yeah, I definitely experienced some of that. Now, I am not in the category of pastors who thought about seriously quitting, but I know colleagues who were. And I credit, that 50 to 60% who stayed engaged, they have really been a true blessing to me and to my family. And even our church financial situation, we struggled some, and we still do a little bit, but we're picking up. We're improving, and I think seeing signs of progress and engagement has given me life. But yeah, no, I definitely developed some unhealthy eating habits, sleeping habits, personal habits that just unhealthy ways of coping with the stress. I would say, I don't know that it was more time, but it was more stress, and so it was more energy that to do the same amount of ministry. Mm-hmm. And that, it took a toll. I'm grateful. Starting on Thursday, I'm taking a week-long vacation, and it's just a week. I'll probably take another one closer to Thanksgiving with family, but I'm grateful for that opportunity. We didn't get too many of those opportunities. And so I think just the long-term wear and tear of trying things and not succeeding. But again, I think the blessing of having a community and a church community, those who were engaged, and I feel loved and blessed, and I feel like God honors that work that they put in, and I've still got members who are putting in that work, and I'm grateful. And we also, I would also say that one thing that did help and gave me life was we did have a Zoom Bible study for this spring for the Gospel of Mark. And we continued on Zoom just because we were already on Zoom. We could have returned in person, but that gave me life. It was good to hear folks engaging with the text. And what was a blessing was that even folks who weren't part of it, we recorded on Zoom, and I would share that video with certain people. And it was a blessing that they would respond and say, "Thank you, Pastor." So Yeah, I would say that there have been blessings, but there've also been, yeah, it's been tough, and it has not always been easy, and it's been a struggle for me emotionally for sure. I struggle with anxiety and mild depression anyway, so the pandemic did not help. So, final note, I will say though, I feel blessed. If I had to deal with a congregation that was fighting all the time about restrictions,
Mm-hmm.
I would have lost my mind. And I know some of my pastor colleagues had that. And it broke, not broke some of them in the sense that they're done with life because, God has given them paths forward. But for some of them, they left ministry. I'm grateful. We had people give opinions. We had people give different opinions. But, I felt blessed that every step of the way, when I sought ad council advice, they were there, they were supportive, they gave feedback, but it was never there was never a sense of, on the one hand, this is all, there was never a sense of like, this is all fake, why are you worried? Nor was there a sense of, there isn't a cost to this. We all knew what the social costs and the community costs were. So I felt blessed by that. And I know other pastors didn't experience that, and I'm sorry for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've heard from other pastors, there was just a lot of the, well, this church down the road is open. Why can't we do this? And, that can be hard because, they may not take the precautions as seriously. And, you want to respect people and don't want people to get sick. And that's a challenge when everyone, I think, just wants to get back to normal. So, what was it like, maybe as you started to see people getting more vaccinated and getting ready to, maybe that there was some light at the end of the tunnel? What did you do and what did your congregation do to prepare for worshiping in person again? And when did that happen?
Yeah, so it was a slow transition. We actually we started outdoors last fall.
Mm-hmm.
Did that for a few months. Because of weather, we shifted indoors. And I actually would have been more worried about that if more people wanted to worship in person, but we didn't have that problem. So most of our people were still worshiping online. And so we could be masked and distanced and it was fine. And so I think just that slow transitions was helpful. And so we did take December off, which did stunt momentum. And I say off, I mean, we still offered pre-recorded worship services, but we took it off from in person. That did not help, but I am grateful that we did it because this community experienced a major spike in December that actually did end up impacting some of my church members. Earlier in the year, in August, we had a church member die from COVID. Okay. And that's our one. We had one, and I grieved over him, and we grieved over him. But these two families, they all recovered, but it was a blessing. We didn't worship in December because they were among those who were coming in person. So that was great that we didn't worship in person. So that was contained mainly with their families. But after that, especially when the vaccine started becoming slowly available, it was just gradual, starting, we're starting to see, we went from seeing 10 to 12 to starting to see 15 to 20. And then for our Spanish worship, we had been doing that only online because our Spanish worship was always smaller. But then we brought that back. I think it was February. The time is blurred. I think it was February. We brought that back, and it was a great joy and blessing. We started with 4 to 5 and 6 to 7. The vast majority of people did not return to worship until they were vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so that, and that was also, I think, helpful for people. They get the vaccine, they could have the confidence to do it. it was also helpful that we worked with the hospital to do a vaccine drive. We didn't make anyone get a vaccine, of course, you can't do that. But I called church members and say, if you're not vaccinated and if you want to get a vaccine, can I send your information to the hospital? And we had a few vaccine skeptics, but for the most part, a lot of people were already vaccinated, and those who weren't said, yes, send it. And the hospital called them and they got vaccinated. And so, I think for me, it was a great process that there wasn't a sudden break. There wasn't a sudden like, oh, now. I think what was disappointing was that it peaked much lower than I expected. And I think that's been the experience of a lot of pastors and churches, that the number of people worshiping in person, even once they're vaccinated and everything, is not as high, is not as much as it was pre-COVID.
Why do you think that is?
I think a few reasons. I think one, folks got out of the habit, and some of the folks just, if they didn't find the online worship appealing, it then exacerbated the consumerist trends that I think we all pastors face. Where it's like, oh, I'll just start watching another church. And so if they even follow church anymore, that's how they approach church increasingly. I think, too, to be less cynical, we had families who developed routines, and it was not unreasonable for them to develop new routines, new habits of work, new habits of study, new habits of how to stay safe and still socialize with family. All these new habits that it's hard to undo that. If, and so, like I have one family, I'd say extended family, probably about 10 to 12 folks in 2 to 3 nuclear families in this one extended family. They started to come in person in shifts because different people within their family had just developed different worship habits and different personal habits, and they're having to unwind those commitments. So to be less, those are the people I'm a little bit less worried about. I just try to reach out to them as best I can, especially once I get back from vacation, really try to focus on that and find ways to connect. And I think that'll help. I am worried about the folks where their tendency to view church as just a commodity to consume, and church is there for us to receive something as opposed to a community to be a part of, that really, I think a lot of those folks, the pandemic didn't help.
What do you think you've learned from this period, and what do you think your church has learned?
That's a good question. I would say that church communities are both stronger and more fragile than I would have anticipated. The level of commitment that those who are committed have is extraordinarily strong. And the ways that churches can adapt. We had to, and it was deeply unfortunate that our administrative assistant and youth director were doing wonderful work. We had to let them both go. And with the administrator, with both of them, it was a longer conversation. We both ended on good terms. We both got to end that relationship at times that worked best for both us and them. And so it was as good of an outcome as you could expect, but it was also sad. And yet we found ways to adapt. Even though they did great ministry and we lost that, we found ways to adapt. So we're more flexible. We're also more fragile in the sense of connection. That especially a lot of the work that we do to try to reach out can easily be undone by seemingly small changes. And obviously COVID wasn't a small change, but by changes that are outside of our control. And so, I think that's one of the things I've had to discern, especially with my own struggles with anxiety and mild depression, is, okay, pastor, what can you control and what can't you control? And having to try to excel at the things I can control, and then for the rest, just leave it up to God. I can't control how many people show up to church. I can control how often I reach out to folks. I can't control the quality of worship, quality of my sermon, getting volunteers. I can control that. And, there are definitely ways that I can improve in that regard. I think all of us can say that. But I can't control the precise number of people who are in church on any given Sunday.
Nope.
It's just out of my control. And so I think having to continually remind myself of that, which is a struggle.
Well, one of the things, just kind of listening here, is that having to let two people associated with the congregation go, and also dealing with the fact that a member of your congregation succumbed to COVID, means you're dealing with a lot of grief. And how did you process that? How did the congregation process that?
That's a good question. I think in many ways we still are. I think one of the ways that I tried to help the congregation was to be very transparent. With regard to the member who died, it was a deeply unfortunate situation where his kids were not involved in the church. They were involved in other churches. So they weren't able to get in touch with us in time for me to do the funeral. And so that was just heartbreaking. I mean, no one really could control it. I mean, it is what it is. But I was able to reach out to them eventually, and I was able to talk to them, and I got their permission to say that Geraldo died. Sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned his name, but the gentleman died from COVID. And so I think just being public, and the same thing with our youth director and our administrator, we were very public about that process and letting people know. I think it also, we've seen modest return in giving, financial giving. Giving went down a lot, although online giving helped stem that, and that's great. But we saw giving go down a lot, but I think we also saw giving start to go up a little bit. Once it was like, oh, our youth director's gone, our administrator's gone. Oh, like, this is serious. This isn't a temporary thing. But yeah, I mean, I'll confess that I'm not always the most effective at consciously processing grief. And I would say this year, I've done a lot of funerals, and they're not COVID related, but just a lot of different, I think just the stress of this year wore on people. And so I'll admit for myself, I don't always I sometimes compartmentalize it too much, and then, process it in unhealthy ways. Just getting mad easily, not eating right, etc. But, the thing that I tried to do for my congregation was to be very public. And I think that did help.
So where do you see the church going from here yourself after having this experience?
I hope to stay, I mentioned our Episcopal system. The standard appointment would be about 4 to 6 years. I've already been here 2 years. And so I hope to be here at least that long, if not longer. This is a wonderful community. And these church members, especially the ones who've stayed committed, and even the ones who've been kind of committed, like they've stayed connected peripherally, they've all been a blessing, and I love them. I don't know what the future holds, though, in terms of sustainability. I do think that this church is stronger than some of our members think. But I also, like I said, I think it's also more fragile. Like a lot of small community churches are more fragile than we once believed. So my hope is that with continued engagement, especially once we get into the fall, I think that'll give me a better sense of where this church is headed. Because right now, a lot of people are traveling in ways that they couldn't last year. And so a lot of our low attendance is impacted by that.
Mm-hmm.
But the fall, that won't be an issue. And so I'm hopeful, but certainly and optimistic about what God can continue to do through our church. This church has been a community staple. The Lord has worked through this church for over 160 years, and
Wow.
I hope that continues.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't, I can't give any guarantees, of course, and we will see where God and the members of this community have us go.
Oh, I think one final question, and I should have asked this earlier, is are you doing singing in person right now, and how are you handling communion, or is that like phased in? Was it a phased in process, or is it?
That's a good question. So we experimented with different things regarding singing in person, and I think because the vast majority of not just our county but of our church in particular
Mm-hmm.
are vaccinated, singing is just not a problem. We just we experimented. We pushed the pulpit back. We did some things to try to keep distance. We had masks on. We required masks until the CDC said that vaccinated people didn't need to wear them. And then we lifted that. So we did try different things. Communion is a little different. Right now, we have those little pre-packaged cups with the wafer inside of them.
Yep, we have those too.
And this last Sunday, I handed them out individually in their seats. I suggested that going forward, they would probably go ahead and come up, starting next month. And I hope to do intinction. Intinction is my favorite form of communion, where you dip the bread in the cup and consume it together. But I think we're probably 3 to 6 months away from that.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I would love to do intinction, but it's one of the things you kind of have to see where things are going and all that. So, one of the other things that is kind of a concern, but everyone's kind of keeping a watchful eye out, are the variants that have been going about. What has your church been doing regarding that?
I'll confess that we have just gone ahead. We did send applications for a summer youth camp because myself and all the youth involved, and even the other adult volunteer, were all vaccinated. And everything I'm keeping an eye on it, but everything I've read said that even though there's an increased chance of infection, of contracting COVID, there's an extremely small chance of any serious illness if you're vaccinated, even from the variants. And so that's what we're doing right now. We're just plowing ahead. And we're like, look, we'll keep an eye on it, but we're going to, right now the data suggests that if you're vaccinated, you're fairly safe. And so I think that we're just going to keep progressing. So.
Okay. Well, Joe, I'm glad that we had this discussion. It was
I am too. I'm glad we got to have this conversation.
So and hopefully we will talk again sometime soon. So
definitely. And thank you, and thank all of your listeners, and blessings to you and your congregation. I know your congregation not only had COVID, but my geography is a little hazy. Y'all were either near or at the city where George Floyd died, right?
We are near. We're in Matamidi, where our church is located, is about 10 miles north of St. Paul. Maybe about 15 miles from Minneapolis. And I live in Minneapolis proper.
Okay.
So, we saw some things up close and personal. So.
Yeah, so I definitely am praying for your congregation and congregations like yours who are dealing with the grief of COVID and the extra layer of grief that I mean, our whole nation was impacted by by questions about racial injustice and policing, and struggling with, you know, especially in communities that are traditionally supportive of law enforcement. How do you process that? But I know that hit especially hard there. So I'm definitely in prayer for y'all.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. So it has been an eventful year in more ways than one in Minnesota. So,
yeah.
So, all right. Well, thank you again. And we will talk again soon.
Okay. Be blessed. Take care.
All right. Well, I am so thankful for Joe being able to take the time to talk to me and to share about his experiences during the pandemic, in that very crazy year that was 2020. Now, I'm not done yet asking. I am still interested in finding out from other pastors who are willing to share their experiences and what happened to their congregation during the pandemic. And if you're interested, drop me an email, and that is at denmin@gmail.com. And if you didn't really pick up that email address, check in the show notes. You'll find it there as well. Well, I want to thank you so much for listening to this podcast. There are so many different podcasts out there, and you could listen to a lot of others. I know you do listen to a lot of others. So I am very thankful for your support. Please make sure to visit our website, enroutepodcast.org, where you can sign up to be on our mailing list of our brand new newsletter, where you can listen to past episodes and also read some articles of mine. And while you're there at the website, you can also make a donation that will support this podcast. And feel free to make a donation of any size, whether it's $1 or $10. And don't forget, again, to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform, be it Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, whatever. And if you like what you're hearing, leave a rating or a written review. Well, that is it for this episode of EnRoute, Notes on Religion, Politics, and Culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care and Godspeed.